September something of 1787. And probably ratified finally by enough states about 4 years later. But the Muhlenberg family falls into this colonial history and Revolutionary War history and early national history because he was born in Germany, but in the 1740s, Pennsylvania Lutherans, and that would have been the colony of Pennsylvania, sent a note back to Germany asking for a pastor to come and serve them. They felt that they needed an ordained pastor. And then, as it worked out, about 10 years later, about 1752, Muhlenberg came to America as a missionary. And then married, and then had a large family. I may have been 11 children. And because he organized the first Lutheran denomination on American soil, the Pennsylvania Ministerium is what it was called, and because he pushed for a single Lutheran church in America, and he pushed for a common liturgy and a common hymnal, one hymnal for everybody. He's considered by many, if not all, the patriarch of Lutheranism in the United States. Now, that side of the Lutheran family tree, if you will, is basically now in the ELCA. The Missouri Synod, which is another big part of the Lutheran family tree in the United States, comes from German immigrants from about 1839, 1840, came from Dresden, which is in Saxony. Muhlenberg himself came from what's called Lower Saxony, or in German, Niedersachsen. So they come from roughly the same area, but as you've listened to the dates, you know, there were Lutherans in America in the 1620s, but they were served by Episcopalian priests. It wasn't until the 1740s that the Pennsylvanians, and you know, street language, you and I probably would refer to these people as Pennsylvania Dutch, but they're not really Holland, they're German. It's Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is the proper German term for Germany, or Germans, Deutschland. So that's 100 years later, and then 100 years after that come the Missouri Synod ancestors. So that's kind of how things stacked up in the first 200 years of Lutheranism. But the family, once they came, you know, once he came to America, married, had a family, well, that's, you know, that 30 or so years, that's colonial. Then you've got the Revolutionary War, then you've got the United States under the Articles of Confederation, and then you've got the Constitution, and then after that, and because so many children, and marrying, and having so many children themselves, this family was a dynasty. And many of them became pastors, teachers, military, and politicians. And were in the Pennsylvania State House, in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, were in the First Continental and probably the Second Continental Congress. I think the oldest sibling, Peter Muhlenberg, may have been the first Speaker of the House of Representatives. But I'd have to look that up to be absolutely certain of that. But I remember when I first learned of all this in the seminary, back then we all had to take a course either in first or second year of seminary. I think it was second year. It was called Lutheranism in America. And it was truly Lutheranism. It was just every brand and branch that you could think of, all in one history class. And I remember something being said about one of those Muhlenbergs being really almost, it was kind of put to us this way, almost kind of the first president of the United States. Because we really didn't have a president of the United States, remember this, until we'd adopted, or at least proposed, the U.S. Constitution, and then elected George Washington and inaugurated him in New York City, and that was in 1789. You know, by then, the Muhlenbergs were already, you know, a very active dynasty in our early American history. So, be that as it may, that's Muhlenberg.
Did Perry County come way after that?
Perry County, that's 100 years.
Perry County is Missouri Synod history, so that's the immigration from Dresden,
Okay.
Germany, in Saxony. That leader, pastor, was Martin Stephan, S-T-E-P-H-A-N. They set out from Germany, winter of, you know, late year of 1839. 3 ships. One was lost at sea. I think it was called the Amalia, A-M-A-L-I-A. Never seen or heard from again. The other 2 made it below Florida, into the Gulf, New Orleans. That's the port of entry. And then from New Orleans, they went up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and then they came back down south, southwest just a little bit to Perry County and settled. Pretty much right on the river, so that if you went straight across the river, you'd go into Illinois. And Martin Stephan got into trouble and was booted. And he did go across the river and into Illinois. He didn't go back to Germany. He stayed in America, settled in Illinois. So then the Missouri Synod ancestors, so our Missouri Synod forebears, they don't have a pastor. So their biggest problem theologically is, are we still a church? They settled that through a series of debates called, I think that's the set of debates or series of debates called the Altenburg debates. And one side of the debate was C.F.W. Walther. And his point, he took the yes we are a church point of view. Oh, I should remember this. I can't remember the person on the other side, but the other side was, no, we're not a church without a pastor. And Walther's point prevailed. That other point did not. Walther was a leading light at the time. After those debates through, there may have been two publications at times. One in German was called Lehre und Wehre, Lehre Lehre und Wehre, that's teaching and truth. And then another, and that was circulated widely in the area, throughout the area. The other one, which really became, I think actually, to this day, we know it as the Lutheran Witness, or maybe that's a successor to Lehre et Wehre. Anyway, the other one was Der Lutheraner, Lutheran with an ER on the end. The Lutheran. And through those publications, Walther was able to gather people who were interested in starting a Lutheran denomination on American soil. And so on April 26th of 1847, 14 congregations met at St. Paul Lutheran Church, which is in downtown Chicago. If you've ever been along the Magnificent Mile, if you've ever walked past the Marriott, which is, and we've stayed there with a youth group before, but the Marriott is on the west side of Michigan Avenue. If you walk into the Marriott, walk through the building, come out the west side, over there very close is still St. Paul Lutheran Church, where this meeting was held. And that formed the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So the birthday of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is April 26, 1847, from that meeting. And yes, it was in Chicago, even though we consider probably our central geographic location in the Missouri Synod is St. Louis. One of the, and I know I read this somewhere, but I'm having a tough time finding it. Again, it's probably buried in a footnote in a book that I read. One of those, I know that one of those 14 congregations was from New Orleans. Because when they came, some of the folk did not go up to St. Louis, they stayed in New Orleans. But they organized a congregation there. I just don't remember its name anymore. But I believe that it kind of became a French-speaking congregation by just a few years because they were pulling in other people who spoke French or Cajun or whatever you speak there. Certainly nothing understandable. But I'm pretty sure that one of the 14 congregations that started the synod was believe it or not, a French-speaking congregation. So then, but they were a German-speaking church. So the title, and I'll give it to you in English because I'm not sure I can remember it very well in German, but it was the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. And they lived with that title for a century, and then in 1947, when we were celebrating our centennial, the synod said, we really need to shorten this up. So they just simply shortened it to the Lutheran Church hyphen, or long hyphen, Missouri Synod. So there you go. One other quickie about the number of denominations in Lutheran denominations in this country. I used to work at Concordia Historical Institute, which is actually on the campus of the seminary, but it's the synod's archives, historical archives. I mean, everything. Fascinating place to work. And I've lost my point. Number of synods. CHI, Concordia Historical Institute, would publish documents or books or monographs or whatever you want to call them. And they had a thick book, kind of, maybe a half-inch thick, and its title was something like The Lutheran Synods of America, or something like that. Before the turn of the 20th century, so just before 1900, there were 200 different Lutheran denominations in the country.
That's Muhlenberg, isn't it?
That's just...
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because when anybody came, they'd all get off the boat, look at one another and go, well, we all speak the same language, we're all from the same place in Germany or Sweden or wherever. Here we are in a strange land, so one of the first things we've got to do is we've got to organize a church body. Because we're all like-minded, we're probably all family. I mean, just a lot of commonalities. So that's why. But then, over the course of time, fewer. Today, I would guess that maybe there are about 25 different Lutheran bodies in the United States. The two largest being the ELCA and the Missouri Synod. I want to say the ELCA might be close to 4 million. The Missouri Synod is maybe about 2.5 million. The third largest is Wisconsin's Synod, but it's much smaller, about 100,000. And then 20 or 22 bodies that are smaller, and in some cases very much smaller than that. And, there's the constant jockeying of people joining together and people getting irritated about something and splitting off. So you've got all that going on. Some of them are very small. I mean, the Eielson Synod, I think, might be 2 congregations and 6 pastors. But they haven't folded structurally. They still exist. So, be that as it may, for what it's worth. very quickly, any questions on that? There will be a test next Wednesday on all that material. It's like the student said, do we have to know this for the test? Yes, you do. So the historical context for Isaiah, again, there's the Syro-Ephraimite War, where Assyria is flexing its muscles, and what happens is the northern kingdom ceases to exist, and the southern kingdom then ends up being a vassal of Assyria. And then there's finally the conquest of, because the Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, then the southern kingdom thinking, okay, this might work if we rebel so that we become free, because the Babylonians have defeated their overlords, but they don't want to be ruled by the Babylonians, so they rebel. Then the Babylonians come in and pretty much flatten them. And that then ends up with the Babylonian exile. And then there's the return. Isaiah himself is 8th century, 700s. But you go through the 600s and into the early 500s, and then they're in exile, and then the return is mid-6th century BC, about 540, 539, and when the ones who do come back get back, they start cleaning up and putting everything in order, and that's when the temple is restored and it's rededicated in 515 BC. And that it's called the second temple to distinguish it from the one built by Solomon. And that's the temple that Herod was refurbishing. He had started to refurbish in 20 BC and was still refurbishing. The refurbishing was going on after his death. Herod died in 4 BC. The refurbishing was still going on. And you might remember that in the Gospels, Jesus says, destroy this temple and I'll build it again in 3 days. Well, the text says he was referring to his body, but his hearers thought he was talking about the physical temple. And what did they say? They said, this thing's been under renovation for 46 years. You're not going to rebuild a destroyed version of it in 3 days. Well, that 46 years is crucial, because if Herod started it at 20 BC, and we're pretty sure that he did, what's 46 years later? It's 26 AD. So you can date that conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees to 26 AD, which is, we all kind of think Jesus' ministry was 30 to 33 AD, but I think it was earlier. And that's just one piece of why I think that. Of course, the other part is that Herod was dead in 4 BC. If he's killing 2-year-old children in Bethlehem in trying to get rid of Jesus after his birth, he's got to be alive to do that, doesn't he? but he's already dead 4 BC. He's killing kids that maybe are 2, because he's done some investigation with the wise men and a few other people. So he thinks that Jesus, his target, might be 2. So if he dies 4 BC, if Jesus is 2, you gotta back up. I think you back up about 7 years. I think Jesus was really born 7 BC. If he died at 33, then he died when? 26 AD. Because that conversation that he's having with the Pharisees is just before his trial and crucifixion. 2 other things that happened in 26 AD that I think also help support, and this is a theory. This is what I accept to deal with the facts, but it's really hard to prove or disprove, but it's my theory, it's what I go with. 2 other things that happened in 26 AD. Pontius Pilate becomes governor, and Caiaphas becomes high priest. Same year. And they're having to both of them are having to deal with Jesus in their rookie years. And Pilate in particular is nervous. He's trying to get this Jesus thing off his plate. And remember, his wife even came to him and said, have nothing to do with this man. I had a dream about it. To stay away from it. And so he basically pushed it off on others. But because both these guys, Herod and Caiaphas, were struggling with this issue, trying to figure out how to deal with it, after Jesus was crucified, the 2 guys became big buddies because they'd survived, each of them had survived a political crisis. They had done it kind of together because they're sending Jesus back and forth. They don't want to deal with it. They want somebody else to deal with it. So, for what it's worth. So that's part of the historical background. Now, the actual reading, starting at Isaiah 25, verse 6. On this mountain, and what that means is Zion, the hill that Jerusalem is built on. The Lord of hosts, in Hebrew that's Yahweh Sebaoth, will make for all peoples a feast of rich food. Now, here you are. This is God bringing everybody together around one big party, and the big party is going to be lavishly appointed. A feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wine strained clear. So that's the higher end variety. The unstrained stuff is cloudy and it's got stuff in it that maybe you don't want to drink, and it's cheaper. But if you've refined it, it's kind of like maybe what you'd see on a wine label, some wine labels today as Vintner's Reserve. Okay, so that's the party. Now what does the next verse say? He will destroy on this mountain. And what that means is it won't be just, the action won't be just for that small locale. What that means is the action is taking place in that small locale, but it has repercussions for the whole world. He will destroy on this mountain, namely Zion, Jerusalem, The shroud that is cast over all peoples. This is a death pall. The sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The popular image was death is the one that does the swallowing. So this is a reversal of that image. Then the Lord God, Yahweh Tsebaoth, will wipe away the tears from all faces. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I didn't do the Hebrew right there. Look at verse 6, the very first phrase that has the words Lord of hosts. Take a look at the word Lord.
All caps.
They're all capital. L is a big capital, but O and R and D are all small capitals. They're not lowercase, they're just smaller capitals. Whenever you see that in your English text, you can know this for certain, that the English word Lord, spelled like that with all four capitals, one bigger, three smaller, is translating the Hebrew name Yahweh. It's not Elohim or Adonai or anything like that, it's Yahweh. And Lord of hosts is Yahweh Tsebaoth. You go down to verse 8, and in that second line it says, then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces. Notice the word Lord. It's a capital L, but then it's O-R-D, all lowercase. In Hebrew, I'm not sure what that is, but it's not Yahweh. It might be Adonai. And then the word God is, again, a large capital and two small capitals. And that translates the Hebrew word Elohim, which is a generic Hebrew word for God. And interestingly, because it ends in I-M, it's a plural. Continuing in verse 8, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth. Now, what's the disgrace of the people? The disgrace of the people is having been flattened by the Babylonians and carted off into captivity. Everything in Isaiah up through and including chapter 39 is probably from that chaotic period where Judah's trying to get out from underneath the lordship of the Babylonians, and the Babylonians coming in and smacking them around and deporting them once in 597 BC, and then they still don't settle down, so then the Babylonians come in and finally just whack them a good one and take everybody out, pretty much. Some people they left behind. But they took the cream of the population, and that was in 586 BC. And then it says, for the Lord has spoken. And now look at Lord again. It's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, but those remaining three letters are smaller. The Hebrew word there is Yahweh again. It will be said on that day. What day? The day of the big party. The day of Yahweh's ultimate victory on behalf of his people. And who's saying it? The people. Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord, Yahweh, for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. And that's where our reading for Sunday stops, but really in the text, the first half of verse 10 is also should be part of the text, but that's all right, they didn't appoint it. 10a, For the hand of the Lord, Yahweh, again, will rest on this mountain. What does that mean? Protection. An establishment. So this is the end time party, the end time banquet. It's closely linked to something in the previous chapter regarding a banquet on Mount Sinai. This is thoroughly part of Jewish imagination at the time. Those who lived in Qumran at the time, they had a document called the Rule of the Community, and that rule of community described what this party was going to be like. And they were expecting it within their lifetimes. That's why they were out there. They were waiting for this party to commence. And they were by the Dead Sea because Jeremiah had predicted that when God returns, the Dead Sea will come back to life. So why do you park yourself next to the Dead Sea, waiting for God's return? You're sitting there waiting for signs of life, and you're going to be the first ones to see it. So you're going to be first in line. See how that expectation drove them? They weren't out there because it was a resort. Although they do, I think it was our second trip. We stayed at a resort hotel on the west side of the Dead Sea, or west shore of the Dead Sea. The only problem was that even by then, 2001, the sea had shrunk so much that if you wanted to go down to the water, you had to take a shuttle for 1.5 miles to get to the water from where the resort hotel had been built. So, yeah, it was close to the water at one time, and then the water left them. Literally, high and dry. Great resort hotel, though. For some reason, they had given us some suite on the top floor, had 2 exits out to rooftop areas, and there was at least 1 hot tub out there, if not 2. And we felt so self-conscious about being treated that way that we just made sure that everybody in the group was invited up to enjoy that with us. Then I always said to Martha, if they ever do that to us again on trips 3, 4, and 5, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make sure that everybody savors that just like we could. Except after that second trip, they never did that again. And I never really understood that, but it was fine. You know, accommodations are pretty wonderful, all things considered. But why that particular trip we had those accommodations, I'll just never know. Well, anyway, that is the first reading.
Somebody didn't turn their phone off.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It's the Malbar Vision Center.
That's nice.
If you turn briefly to Matthew 22, I'll just remind you of the opening of the reading for Sunday. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. And you know the story. When the party was ready to roll, nobody showed up. So he invites again. Nobody shows up. So finally, he sends out his employees to just find anybody that they can and bring them into the party. Now, that's the whole business. That, you know, we've already run into this in chapter 21. You know, the way the tenants treated the people that the landowner sent to get his share of the crop, or how they mistreated him. You know, Jesus concludes, you know, this is going to be taken away from you and given to others. And now here's a parable that illustrates that very point of taking something away and giving it to others, except there's a bit of a wrinkle in this one, and I'm going to try to deal with that from the pulpit on Sunday. Because when all these people are compelled to come into this party, and they weren't on the original invite list to begin with, so they're just anybody. And you could reason to yourself, wait a minute, I'm out here on the street, I'm not expecting to be invited to some big, huge, fancy party, so I'm not properly dressed, but they're compelling me to go into the party anyway. But deeper into this text, the guy who throws the party originally is in the room walking around, and he finds somebody that's not properly dressed and tosses him back out on the street. You know, most of us are going to sit here and think, wait a minute. That doesn't square up exactly. Except the whole point is, you need to be properly dressed in the righteousness of Christ. They don't want you to be so worried about the guy out that gets tossed back out on the street. It's a parable anyway, so it's all made up. There is no real guy that's being mistreated here. But the point is being made that if you're in the party and staying in the party, you're dressed in Christ and no other way. So that's where this parable eventually comes down to, is how are you dressed? Are you relying on yourself, or are you dressed in Christ? Let's see if I survive that on Sunday. I don't know. It's one of these parables that's just a little bit disconcerting. And you got to sit there and go, okay, what does this mean? Oh, that sounds Lutheran, doesn't it? What does this mean?
What is this?
And I will remind you that apparently Abraham Lincoln once said, you know, it's not the stuff in the Bible that I don't understand that rattle me. It's the stuff that I do understand that rattles me. Now, that isn't exactly the way he said it, but that's the point he was making. So, all right, we're good to go, I think. And thank you for your participation and your tolerance, certainly.
Pastor, you were mentioning before how the calendar and all that. Okay, we have an ex-son-in-law who believes that October is when we celebrate Christ's birth.
Oh.
He celebrated last week and gave out a couple presents. I don't know what group he's involved with or what study, but.
Well, I know that the Orthodox Church, they celebrate Epiphany and the baptism of Jesus and the birth of Jesus all on January 6th. I'll have to look that up. I'll have to look that up.
Their Easter's different,
The scriptures never really state.
usually.
Well, we don't really know, do we?
No,
December.
we don't.
That's what I told my granddaughter, his daughter, so we were talking about it. She said, Dad did Christmas last week, and really? He gave me, anyway.
It
And
took the church a long time to
Yeah.
even get
And I
around
told
to
her, I
celebrating
said,
Christmas.
I said, Sarah, the important thing is, he believes in Jesus, and we
Yeah.
don't actually technically
Yeah.
know.
It even took the church a few centuries to get around to celebrating Easter as a Sunday in the year. Because before then, they were simply every Sunday celebrating Easter. But for a long time, they didn't have this developed calendar either. Although, because there was the Jewish part of the church that was headquartered in Jerusalem, where a lot of the events took place or nearby, what the church would do in its very early years to worship, because they didn't necessarily have churches built yet, they would simply go to the place where it took place, the event that they were commemorating, and worship at the place on that particular Sunday. So they'd go to Calvary or Golgotha, Calvary, or the tomb, or the place of ascension, Gethsemane. They would go to, and of course the birth, if they wanted to commemorate that at all in the early centuries. A few miles outside of town would be Bethlehem, but that'd be a bit of a journey for them. Even 5-7 miles then would be a trek. And Jill and I'll, and it's not Jill's fault, I have to get my act together. I need to consult with Jill. We'll get these liturgical calendars ordered for you, and then whoever wants them, you can claim one and keep it at home. And then you can just watch the church year progress as we go through it from Sunday to Sunday. Okay?
All right.
Thank you.
That must have been cool.
We'll see you Sunday.
Yeah.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
because, it's nice to worship anywhere.
Wonderful, how are you?
That, to me, that would just